The first time I saw the Kethra signal, I was standing in the ruins of what used to be my kitchen, holding a cold cup of coffee, watching Mara's car pull out of the driveway for the last time. She didn't look back. I didn't expect her to. 3 months. That's how long she'd been gone, a research posting on the outer station at Callisto, or so she'd told me. Long distance was hard, she'd said. The signal lag alone made real conversation impossible. I'd understood. I'd been patient. I'd built the nursery anyway because we'd talked about a family before she left, because I'd believed in the version of us that existed before the posting, before the silence that stretched across the months like the vacuum between worlds. She came back on a Tuesday. She came back with a belly she couldn't hide, and a story she couldn't finish, and the words she kept almost saying hung in the air between us like smoke. His name was Declan, a fellow researcher on the station. She didn't love him, she said. It just happened. She wanted to keep it. She wanted to talk about what that meant for us. I listened to every word. I made more coffee while she talked, because having something to do with my hands was the only way I could stay in the kitchen with the conversation, rather than leaving my body entirely. She sat at the table where we'd eaten breakfast for 4 years, and she talked, and I stood at the counter with my back to her for parts of it because I needed a moment where she couldn't see my face. She was braced for anger. I could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way her hands were folded too tightly on the table. She was ready for me to shout, or to go cold, or to say something that would draw a clean line between before and after. I think she needed that. I think she'd been rehearsing a version of this conversation in which I made it easy by giving her something clear to react to. I didn't give it to her. "I'm going to go to Eli's," I said. "I need some time." She nodded. Relief and something else, guilt, maybe, or disappointment, the particular disappointment of someone who wanted a fight and didn't get one. I picked up my keys and my jacket. I didn't take much else. I'd learned, somewhere in the years of working with deep space signals, that the things you carry determine how far you can travel. Then I drove to my brother Eli's house because I didn't know where else to go, and I sat in his kitchen while he made me terrible instant coffee, and I didn't speak for about 40 minutes, and neither did he. That was the kind of man Eli was. He knew when words would make it worse. What he didn't tell me, what he'd been holding for 3 months because he thought I needed to hear it from Mara first, was that he'd been taking care of someone. 2 someones. He walked me down the hall and opened the door to the second bedroom, and I saw them. 2 cribs, side by side. 2 sleeping faces that were unmistakably mine. Freya and Cassius, 4 months old. Born while Mara was at Callisto, and I was eating takeout alone in our house, building a nursery for someone else's child. The woman who'd given birth to them was Maya, Mara's best friend. The woman who'd been my closest confidant when Mara left. The woman who'd listened to me talk about loneliness and loss and the way silence could hollow a person out. The woman I'd apparently done more than talk to, in a period of grief I only half remembered now, a month after Mara's departure, one night when Maya had brought wine, and the house had felt too large and human warmth had felt like the only thing standing between me and the dark. Maya had found out she was pregnant. She hadn't told me. She'd told Eli. She'd said she needed time to figure out what she wanted, and then she'd had the babies and looked at their faces and decided she wanted their father to know. I stood in that doorway for a long time. Freya opened one eye. It was the same gray as mine. She yawned enormously and closed it again with the total indifference of a person who has recently figured out that the world owes her sleep. I laughed. I don't know why. Maybe because the universe had just handed me the most complex possible version of the life I thought was over, and laughing was the only response that didn't involve falling down. I was still laughing quietly when my comm unit buzzed. Priority signal, government encryption, Xeno contact division. I'd worked for XCD for 11 years. Deep space relay analysis, The unglamorous work of sifting through the static of the cosmos for anything that wasn't static. I was good at it in the way that people who have no instinct for normal life sometimes find they have a profound instinct for other things. I was good at it the way a man who can't hold a relationship together can sometimes hold a whole frequency spectrum in his head and feel the wrongness before the computers flag it. The signal I'd been tracking for 6 weeks, the one I'd filed 17 reports about and been told to deprioritize, had activated. The Kethra were here. I knew what they were. Everyone in my division knew. The Kethra had been in our records for 90 years, a ghost species catalogued from trajectory analysis and the ruins they left behind on 3 uninhabited moons at the edge of the outer system. They didn't communicate. They didn't announce themselves. They arrived, they assessed, and they took what they needed from whatever was present. On the first moon, designated Outpost 12 in the old survey records, they'd found a bacterial ecosystem and a methane ocean. They'd drained the ocean and left. On the second, they'd found a colony of something loosely analogous to cephalopods, complex enough to have social structures, primitive enough to have no technology. The Kethra had taken the entire population, not killed them, taken them, the way you collect specimens. On the third moon, they'd found one of our unmanned survey probes. That was 90 years ago. The signal activation meant they decided to come see what had sent it. I kissed both my children on their foreheads, which was, I was aware, an insane thing to do given that I'd known they existed for approximately 9 minutes, and I drove to the XCD facility at the edge of the city while the sky was still dark. The briefing room was already full when I arrived. Commander Hesse Vale was at the head of the table, her face carrying the particular stillness of a person who has prepared themselves for a very bad meeting. Around her sat the people I'd worked with for the last decade: analysts, communication theorists, xenobiologists, a few military liaisons whose presence told me the assessment had already moved past scientific and into strategic. I was the only person who'd actually predicted this. Nobody mentioned that. The facility was 3 underground levels and a surface building that looked, from the outside, like a data archive for agricultural surveys. Nobody ever gave it a second glance. 11 years of working there had cured me of the impulse to find that ironic. The most important things were usually hidden in plain sight, cataloged under headings that made them sound like something else. That was the thing about working in signals analysis. You learned to distrust obvious labels. The signal that looked like static turned out to be something else. The absence that looked like silence turned out to be something listening. Vale was the kind of leader who did all her catastrophizing privately, who walked into the room having already imagined the worst outcome in full detail, and emerged from that imagining calm. I had seen her absorb bad news without flinching for a decade. Tonight she was flinching, subtly, in the way that only the people who knew her best would notice. I noticed. "They've entered the inner system," Vale said. "One vessel, mass equivalent to a medium-sized asteroid. They haven't responded to any of our broadcast frequencies. They aren't broadcasting themselves. They are on an intercept course with the orbital platform. Myra Station. Our largest orbital installation, 1,200 people, scientists, engineers, support staff, a full medical research division, children, a school. Time to intercept. 31 hours at their current velocity. And our response options. The military liaison, a colonel named Brandt, laid out 4 scenarios in the flat, effect-free tone of a man who had briefed rooms full of frightened people before. The scenarios ranged from evacuation of the platform and observation, to things that were more aggressive and correspondingly less likely to succeed against a vessel whose hull composition we didn't understand, and whose weapons we could only infer from the craters they'd left on the first moon, when something had apparently annoyed them. He made each option sound equally viable. That was the skill of someone who'd spent their career turning choices into briefings, make the options into a list, Assign probabilities. Let the room decide. Don't let the room see that some options led off a cliff. Around the table, people were doing the calculation in their heads. I could see it in the way they held their faces, the particular blankness of people who are processing something frightening, and have decided that the most useful thing they can do right now is not show how frightening they find it. Analysts who had spent their careers preparing contingency documents were now sitting inside a contingency document, and there was something clarifying about that. I listened to all 4 scenarios, then I said, "We're looking at this wrong." Vale looked at me. "Jaren, probe they found 90 years ago. We know what it broadcast. Standard contact package, mathematical sequences, carbon-based biology markers, star charts, the whole Sagan protocol. We sent them a calling card. They're here because of it. That means they came to see what sent it, not to destroy it. If they wanted to destroy it, they'd have done it from the outer system. One of their weapons has orbital range at minimum. We know that from the crater analysis. They haven't used it. They're here to look." "And Myra Station is what they're looking at," Brant said. "Yes, because it's the biggest, most complex human structure in their line of approach. It's the most interesting thing we've put in space. If you were traveling 4 light years to examine a species, and you found one of their most impressive constructions sitting right there in orbit, you'd go to that first. Which doesn't solve the problem of 1,200 people aboard." "No," I agreed, "but it changes what we do next. We don't evacuate and hope they ignore the empty shell. We send someone there. Someone who can do what the probe couldn't, not just broadcast but respond. Actually communicate, not signals, presence." The room was quiet. "You're suggesting we give them a human to study," Brant said. "I'm suggesting we give them contact. There's a difference. The probe told them we existed. If we run now, it tells them we're afraid of them. And species that run from the Kethra don't appear to survive their first encounter. The ones on that second moon ran. We have the trajectory analysis. They scattered. The Kethra collected every last one of them." Vale looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You're volunteering." I hadn't known that I was until she said it. And then I knew it with total certainty. The way you sometimes know things about yourself that you've been circling for years without landing. "Yes," I said. I called Eli from the transport. He answered on the second ring, which told me he was awake, which told me someone had fed him the same news that was now spreading through every government channel. "The twins are going to know their father," I told him, "whatever happens." "I know," he said. A pause. Outside the transport window, the city was still dark. A few hours until dawn. Streetlights making pools of yellow in the black. The kind of hour when everything feels like it belongs to a different logic than the daylight hours, when the normal rules have loosened slightly and you can say things you'd rap differently in the afternoon. "I've been doing this job for 11 years, I said. Listening for signals in the noise. People ask me what it's like, and I usually say it's like trying to hear someone talking across a very large room at a very loud party. But that's not quite it. It's more like, you know something is there before you can hear it. You feel the shape of it in the data, a kind of negative space, something the noise is organized around even though you can't see the thing itself yet. You wait, you stay with it, and eventually it resolves." "Okay," Eli said, in the tone of someone who is listening and not interrupting and knows that the point will arrive. "Those 2 kids," I said, "they were the thing the noise was organized around. I just didn't know it yet." He was quiet for a moment. "That's going to make a great story to tell them when they're older," he said. "Or a terrible one." "Both," he said. "That's what good stories are." "Tell Maya," I started, and then stopped, because there was nothing I could say to Maya that fit into a calm call, nothing that covered the strange geography of what we were to each other, nothing that would adequately convey that I was grateful, that I was terrified, that the image of those 2 small faces was the thing I was carrying into whatever came next. "I'll tell her," Eli said. There was a pause, not a bad pause, the kind of pause between people who have known each other long enough that silence is also a kind of talking. "You were always the one who stayed," he said. "When we were kids, when things got hard, you were the one who didn't run." I didn't know what to do with that. I remembered running from plenty of things. I remembered 3 months of not knowing how to bridge the distance to Callisto, not knowing how to say the silence is killing me. I remembered every conversation I'd ended before it got too hard, every silence I'd chosen over the vulnerability of asking for what I needed. I was not, by my own accounting, someone who consistently stayed. But maybe he was seeing something I couldn't see from the inside. Maybe staying wasn't the absence of the impulse to run. Maybe it was the choice you made in spite of it, because something on the other side was worth more than the comfort of going. "Take care of them," I said. "Obviously," he said. And there was something in that word, the bluntness of it, the absolute certainty, the refusal to make it into a speech, that was more comforting than anything longer would have been. Myra Station smelled like recycled air and machine oil, and the particular institutional cleanliness of a place that has to be kept sterile because it floats in the void. I knew the smell. I'd done a posting here 4 years ago, back when Mara and I were still solid, back when the future felt like a straight road. Now I walked the corridors while the evacuation ran in the opposite direction. People moving steadily, without panic, the practiced efficiency of a crew that had drilled for emergencies even if not for this specific emergency. And I felt the station emptying around me the way a house empties when someone leaves. The skeleton crew was 7. Myself and 6 others who'd volunteered or been assigned to stay, 2 engineers, a xenobiologist named Dr. Ife Obasi who'd spent her career theorizing about exactly this scenario, a medic named Chen, and 2 communication specialists. We had 37 minutes before the Kethra vessel reached intercept range. I walked the station while the evacuation finished. The corridors emptied in layers, first the families with children, organized by deck and section, moving with the practiced quiet of a drill that everyone had hoped they'd never use. Then the support staff. Then the research teams, carrying what they could from their labs in bags and sealed containers, years of work compressed into what could be hauled through an airlock in under 3 minutes. I passed the school. The displays were still lit, a lesson about the geology of Europa still up on the board, someone's half-finished drawing of a cross-section left on a desk. A jacket hung on the back of a chair. The room smelled of chalk and the particular synthetic rubber of the floor mats where the younger kids did exercises. Someone had left a stuffed bear behind, wedged between the leg of a desk and the wall, and I stood in the doorway for a moment looking at it before I kept moving. A woman passed me in the corridor, 35 maybe, a senior hydrologist named Yun whose work I'd read in briefings. She was carrying a sealed case in both hands and moving with efficient purpose, but she met my eyes as she passed and slowed for just a moment. "Good luck," she said. The way she said it had weight in it, not performed, not a courtesy, the specific gravity of one person handing something to another across a gap they can't bridge. "You too," I said. She nodded once and kept moving. Families moved together, children held by parents who moved with the deliberate calm of adults performing courage for the benefit of people who were watching. I passed a boy, maybe 8 years old, who was carrying a small stuffed animal with the single-minded focus of someone whose entire immediate world had been reduced to one object that needed protecting. His mother had him by the hand. Neither of them looked at me. They were already somewhere else in their minds, already past this corridor and onto the transport and away. I understood that impulse completely. I also understood that someone had to go the other direction. Obasi found me at the main observation port, watching the vessel approach on the forward display. It was unlike anything in our records. Organic in its geometry, not the hard angles of our own construction, but something grown rather than built. a shape that suggested the internal logic of a living thing scaled up to the size of a city block, dull and gray-brown against the black, trailing no exhaust, making no sound that our instruments could detect. It moved with the unhurried certainty of something that had nowhere to be except exactly where it was going. "It's not accelerating," she said. "No. They know we're here." "Yes. Are you scared?" I thought about it. I thought about Freya's yawn. I thought about the nursery I'd built in the wrong house for the wrong child, and how somehow that felt like it had been practice for something else entirely. I thought about the 90-year gap between the probe and this moment, and all the humans who'd lived and worked and argued and loved in that gap without knowing that somewhere in the dark, something had been moving toward them, patient and purposeful, following the signal we'd sent into the universe like a return address on a letter. "Yes," I said, "but not more scared than I am curious." She smiled at that, the half-smile of someone who has spent their life in the same discipline and recognizes a kindred pathology. The first contact came not as sound but as light, a pulse of bioluminescent blue that moved across the hull of their vessel in a wave, visible on our displays, repeating 3 times. Obasi was at the sensor array before the second pulse finished. "It's structured," she said. "Mathematical, base 7, that's unusual. Most of what we'd theorized was base 6 or 8. Her fingers moved across the panel. "They're repeating the probe's mathematical sequence back at us. Modified. There's an addition at the end." "What's the addition?" She was quiet for a moment. "A question, I think. The original sequence established shared number language. They're asking us to confirm we received it." I moved to the array beside her. My hands knew this work. 11 years of signals analysis, 11 years of listening for the thing that wasn't noise, and here it was, not noise at all but the clearest possible transmission. "Hello, we heard you, are you still there?" "Yes," I said, and I keyed the response protocol and we told them, yes. What followed was 3 hours of the most focused, strange, and unexpectedly beautiful work I have ever done. It wasn't language, not yet. It was mathematics, and then geometry, and then biology. The probe's markers played back with additions, questions embedded in the variations, and us responding, confirming, extending. Obasi was extraordinary. She'd spent 20 years preparing for exactly this conversation, and she moved through it the way musicians move through a piece they've practiced until it lives in their hands, not thinking, just playing. What I contributed was different. I'd spent my career listening not for what was there, but for what was almost there, the signal and the noise, the intention behind the pattern. And somewhere in the 3rd hour, I started hearing something in the Kethra transmissions that the mathematical analysis wasn't catching. A rhythm, a texture, the same message appearing at the end of multiple sequences, too consistent to be accidental, too complex to be noise. I wrote it out longhand because sometimes that helps me see what my eyes skip over on a screen. I stared at it. I showed it to Obasi. "It's a designation," she said. "I think. It's the way they've been labeling their sequences. This marker always appears at the end of the ones that contain questions. It might be identifying the sender, like a name." I looked at it for a long moment. Then I transmitted our own designation back, the XCD identifier code, the station registry, and below both of them the thing that neither was, my own name in the same mathematical notation, approximate and imprecise but intentional. Human. Personal. The response came faster than anything had come before. A single burst, short, complex. Obasi translated it in silence, her face doing the thing faces do when the mind encounters something it wasn't expecting. "They're asking," she said slowly, "whether the designation refers to a single entity." "Yes," I said and transmitted it. Another fast response. "They want to know," she said, "whether a single entity can speak for the collective." I understood then what they were asking. This was what they'd come to see, not our technology, not our structures, not our biology, though all of those interested them. They'd come to understand the relationship between the individual and the species, whether we had one, whether a single point of contact could meaningfully represent a whole. The Kethra, I realized, might not be a species in the way we understood the term. They might be something closer to a network, distributed, collective, the individual nodes expressive of the whole, and they were trying to determine whether we were the same. I spent 5 minutes thinking about the right answer, because the honest answer was sometimes and sometimes not. And the gap between those two things was where most of human history lived, in the tension between the self and the collective, the individual will and the shared survival, the person who wants to run and the species that needs to stand still. I typed my answer carefully. A single human cannot speak for all. A single human can choose to try. The silence afterward was longer than anything that had come before. Brant's voice crackled over the command channel. "Jaren, they've stopped responding. Their vessel has adjusted heading. They're coming in closer." "I know. We have a weapons response prepared." "Don't," I said. "Please don't. They could be preparing too. They could be preparing to look. Let them look." The Kethra vessel came to within 400 meters of Myra Station and held position. On the external cameras, we could see its surface clearly now. The texture was not quite biological but not quite mechanical, more like a coral formation grown according to mathematical principles, gray-brown lattices and channels running in patterns that almost made sense if you looked at them long enough. There were no windows. There were no visible weapons. There was no airlock we could identify. Then there was. A section of hull dissolved, not opened, but changed, a gradual transparency spreading through the lattice like water soaking into fabric, until there was an opening the size of a large doorway, lit from within with the same bioluminescent blue we'd seen in their transmissions, steady and unwavering. An invitation. I looked at Obasi, she looked at me. "I'll need a suit," I said. Chen had my EVA suit prepped inside 8 minutes, which was faster than it had any right to be. He checked every seal twice without being asked, moving around me with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that the most useful thing he could do right now was this, exactly this, and nothing else. When he finished, he stood back and looked at me with the expression of a man who has run out of practical ways to help and is trying to decide what else he can offer. "I did 2 years on the Europa Deep Ice Station," he said. "First winter I was the only doctor. There was a turbine accident in January. 3 people didn't make it. The rest of the crew, we were all in the same small space for months after with the same grief and no room to put it anywhere." He paused. "You learn pretty fast that the only thing that works is being with people, actually with them, not trying to fix it." "I know," I said. "I know you know," he said. "I just wanted to say it out loud, I think, in case it helps." It did help. In the specific way that things which are already true become more true when someone says them to you at the right moment. One of the engineers, a woman named Sato who had spoken maybe 15 words since I'd arrived at the station, handed me a small piece of wire bent into a loose spiral, the kind of unconscious fidget object that people make when their hands need something to do while their minds are elsewhere. "For the walk," she said, "something to hold." I put it in my suit pocket. I don't know why, but it felt like the right thing to do. The walk between stations took 11 minutes in the EVA suit. 11 minutes of perfect silence, the kind that space provides and nothing else does. No air to carry vibration, no ground to transmit impact, just the stars and the suit and the slow approach of something that the whole of human history had been building toward without knowing it. I could hear my own breathing. I could feel my own heartbeat. I thought about Freya. I thought about Cassius. I thought about the way Freya had opened that one eye and assessed me and decided I was insufficiently interesting to stay awake for. The total pragmatism of infancy. the absolute refusal to be impressed by anything that doesn't provide warmth or food or safety. I hope she kept that quality. I hoped both of them kept it. The ability to assess without sentiment, to see what was actually there rather than what you hoped was there. The opening waited for me, blue and patient. I went through it. The interior of the Kethra vessel was nothing I had words for. Not at first. My brain was trying to apply every reference it had: architecture, biology, engineering, and none of them fit. The space was large, larger than the opening suggested, and it was organized on principles I couldn't quite isolate, passages and chambers that followed their own logic, surfaces that were not quite walls and not quite membranes, a persistent ambient light that came from everywhere and nowhere. It was the most alien thing I had ever experienced, and I had spent 11 years studying alien phenomena. I stood in the entrance, and I did not move. A shape emerged from the interior, then another, then 3 more. The Kethra were approximately 2 meters tall, bilaterally symmetrical, with 4 limbs and a distinct anterior structure that I supposed served as a head, though it was not shaped like any head I had reference for. Their surfaces were the same gray-brown lattice as their ship, though finer, more complex, and in motion, the lattice patterns shifting slowly across their bodies in a continuous process that my mind insisted on reading as breath even though I knew it wasn't breath. They moved with a deliberate quiet that wasn't stillness. It was attention. Every movement carried the weight of intention. They stopped 4 meters away. They looked at me. I looked at them. We stayed that way for a long moment that was also, somehow, not uncomfortable. It felt like the moment before a conversation starts, when both parties have arrived and arranged themselves, and there's a breath of mutual preparation before anyone speaks. I raised my hand. Not a wave. I didn't want to seem performatively friendly or performatively harmless. Just an acknowledgement. I am here. I see you. The nearest Kethra raised one of its limbs in a gesture that was not my gesture and not a mirror of my gesture, but something in between, something that said, I see you. I know you are here. I have been waiting. What followed was not easy. It was the hardest thing I have ever done, and I have done things that required physical courage and things that required emotional endurance, and this required both simultaneously and something else besides. A quality I don't have a name for, something like listening, and something like patience, and something like the willingness to be wrong about everything you assumed and start from the beginning. We communicated through the mathematical framework we'd established, modified in real time, extended by gestures that we both improvised and then repeated, and then treated as established, built a vocabulary the way languages must originally have been built, laboriously and collaboratively, 2 intelligences leaning toward each other across a gap that was also a bridge. The nearest Kethra, I had started thinking of it as the speaker, which was probably not accurate. Probably the Kethra didn't have designated speakers any more than a brain has a designated neuron, but the term helped me organize my experience of the exchange, moved closer in the second hour. Not threatening, investigating. The way you might lean forward when someone is explaining something complex and you want to see the diagram more clearly. It raised one of its limbs and made a slow gesture toward the comm device on my suit, then toward my face, then back to its own anterior structure. You speak with tools, I interpreted it to mean. We speak with ourselves. I keyed a response in the notation. The tools extend what I can do. The intent comes from me. The speaker held still for a long moment. Then something shifted in the lattice patterns moving across its surface. A subtle change in rhythm that I was beginning to read, very tentatively, as engagement, as the Kethra equivalent of leaning forward. They were interested in the distinction, the gap between intention and expression, the fact that I needed intermediaries, technology, language, mathematical notation, to communicate what I meant, and that this created a necessary distance between the thing I knew internally and the thing that arrived at the other end. For the Kethra, as far as I could understand, there was no such gap. What one of them knew, the collective knew. Not via transmission, not a signal sent and received, but directly, the way your left hand knows where your right hand is without being told. They did not understand loneliness the way we understood it, because there was no mechanism by which they could be isolated from meaning. No signal could fail to arrive if you were the signal and the receiver simultaneously. We communicated through the mathematical framework we'd established, modified in real time, extended by gestures that we both improvised and then repeated, and then treated as established. Built a vocabulary the way languages must originally have been built, laboriously and collaboratively, two intelligences leaning toward each other across a gap that was also a bridge. Hours passed. I lost track of exactly how many. Obasi was in my earpiece, relaying questions, confirming translations, catching things I missed because I was too close to the exchange to see the pattern. Between my instinct for signal and her 2 decades of theory, we were something better than either of us alone. I learned things. The Kethra had encountered 17 species in their explorations. Of those 17, 3 had survived first contact in a form that led to ongoing relationship. The others had either fled, attacked, or collapsed under the weight of confirmation that they were not alone. The ones who fled, they tracked out of curiosity until the tracking became impractical. The ones who attacked, they defended against until the attack stopped or the attacker was gone. The ones who collapsed, they observed until the collapse ran its course, and then they moved on. The 3 who survived contact had all done the same thing. They had stayed. Not passively, not frozen by fear and accidentally stationary. Actively. They had chosen to remain present, chosen to communicate, chosen to accept the cognitive dissonance of encountering something genuinely other and not resolve it by making the other thing small or threatening or dismissible. They had sat with the alien until it became, incrementally, less alien. We were the 4th. I sat in the interior of their vessel for 9 hours. Obasi relayed questions through my comm. I relayed answers back. Brant stopped transmitting after the first hour, which I chose to interpret as trust rather than communication failure. The Kethra asked about reproduction. I explained it, inadequately, in the shared notation. They found it remarkable, the way the genetic material of 2 individuals combined into a new entity that was neither of them and both of them, the way this process happened inside the body of one parent but was the product of 2, the way the resulting individual was related to but distinct from the collective. They returned to this theme multiple times. I got the impression it was genuinely fascinating to them in the way that certain problems in my own field were genuinely fascinating, not because they were practically important, but because they were theoretically beautiful. I thought about Freya and Cassius, related to me and to Maya and to each other, distinct from all of us, already their own entities in their cribs in Eli's house. I thought about the strange architecture of how they'd come to exist, Mara leaving, Maya arriving, grief and warmth, and something that had grown from an unlikely combination of circumstances into 2 small people who had absolutely no idea how complicated their origin story was and wouldn't for years. I tried to explain that complexity in mathematical notation. It was, objectively, ridiculous, but the Kethra engaged with it with complete seriousness, and somewhere in the middle of the attempt I understood what they were actually asking. They weren't asking about human reproduction in the abstract. They were asking about connection, about the specific way that humans formed bonds that weren't purely genetic, weren't purely practical, weren't purely anything, bonds that were complicated and often broken, and often rebuilt in forms that didn't resemble their original shape. They had no equivalent. The Kethra were collective. Their individual nodes existed in continuous communication with the whole. What one experienced, all experienced to some degree. There was no gap between selves that needed bridging. There was no loneliness in their architecture. There was no betrayal because there was no separation between the betrayer and the betrayed. There was also, I gradually understood, no grief like human grief. No loss that hit a single point and had to be processed by a single consciousness without the automatic buffering of a collective that shared the weight. They were fascinated by this too, by the idea that a single human could carry a sorrow that the rest of the species didn't automatically feel, that you could stand in a room full of people and be entirely alone. I stayed with that for a moment, thinking about standing in my kitchen with a cold cup of coffee, about the 3 months of silence across the distance between Earth and Callisto, about sitting in Eli's kitchen not speaking for 40 minutes, both of us carrying the same weight in different ways, Eli having known something I didn't, both of us navigating the strange territory of a grief that had to be managed privately even when it was shared. Yes, I told them, that is something humans do. We carry things alone even when we don't have to. Why, they asked. I tried to answer, because we don't trust the collective to carry it without changing it. Because the weight of a private sorrow feels like it belongs to you, and sharing it feels like giving something away. Because loneliness is sometimes easier than the vulnerability of being known. The Kethra were still for a long time after that. Then the nearest one made a motion I hadn't seen before, a slow, deliberate movement of its anterior structure that I found myself reading as something very close to acknowledgement. Not agreement, not sympathy. Something more like, we see this in you, and it is not what we expected, and we did not expect to find it significant, and we do. The communication that followed was longer and more complex than anything that had come before, and I will spend years understanding it fully. The core of it was this. The Kethra had encountered individual-based species before. None of them had survived contact the way we were surviving it. Not because of our technology or our resistance or our capability for violence. They had encountered all of those things in other species. What they hadn't encountered was the specific quality we were demonstrating in this moment, which their notation expressed in a compound they kept returning to that Obasi, and I would later translate, inadequately but approximately, as chosen presence. The ability to be alone and to choose not to be. To have the gap between selves and decide to bridge it, to be capable of isolation and capable of connection, and to live in the tension between them without collapsing into one or the other. To stay. That was what had differentiated the survivors, not strength, not intelligence, not capability, the willingness to remain present in the face of something that offered every rational justification for flight. I sat in their vessel for 9 hours. When I returned to Myra Station, the first thing I did was eat an entire container of cold, reconstituted rice, because I hadn't eaten in 11 hours, and my body had opinions about that. The second thing was sit down with Obasi and Brandt, and the rest of the skeleton crew, while they looked at me like I was something that had come back from somewhere they hadn't been sure I'd come back from. I looked the same as when I left. I felt different in a way I couldn't describe yet. They're leaving, Brandt said. Their vessel changed heading 12 minutes ago. They're moving out of the inner system. They'll come back, I said. How do you know? Because they stayed. Species that are done with you don't stay. They got what they came for, or they didn't get it and they've decided to wait and try again. Either way, they're not done with us. We passed something. I'm not sure exactly what, but we passed something. Brandt looked at me for a long moment with the expression of a man who had prepared thoroughly for a very bad outcome and was not quite sure how to recalibrate for an outcome that was just strange. We'll need a full debrief, he said. I know. And a psychological evaluation. I know. And there will be a very long report. I wrote 11 preliminary reports that no one read, I said. I'm aware of the process. He almost smiled. Obasi was standing at the observation port where I'd found her hours earlier, looking out at the space where the Kethra vessel had been. I stood beside her. "You know what they were most interested in," she said, "in the whole exchange." "The reproduction question," I said. "Yes, but specifically the part about why the genetic combination produces a new entity rather than a blend. Why the offspring isn't just the average of the parents. Why it's something genuinely new." "What did you make of it?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think they don't understand emergence," she said. "Or they understand it theoretically, but they've never experienced it. In a collective, everything is the sum of its parts. Nothing arises from the combination that wasn't already somewhere in the individual nodes. But in us, the child is something neither parent is. Not predictable from the inputs. Novel." She turned slightly. "It's the same thing you did out there. You walked in with the mathematics we'd established together, and what you built with them was something neither of us had predicted individually." I looked at the space where the vessel had been. "Emergence. Humanity's strangest and most powerful trick," she said. "The ability to produce genuinely new things from the combination of existing things, the whole being more than the sum of its parts." A pause. "They weren't afraid of us, you know. They were genuinely curious. I don't think they've ever encountered a species that works the way we do." Chen brought us both coffee. Real coffee. He'd apparently found a sealed supply in one of the labs. It was very good. We drank it standing at the observation port, while Brandt filed his preliminary report in Sato, and the other engineer did systems checks, with the practiced focus of people who process things by staying busy. "I keep thinking about the probe," I said. "The contact package. 90 years ago, someone decided it was worth sending. A signal into the dark with a return address attached. They didn't know if anything would hear it. They didn't know if hearing it would be safe. They sent it anyway because the alternative was silence, and silence felt worse." I held the warm cup. "That person, whoever made that decision, they spoke for all of us 90 years ago, and they couldn't have known that's what they were doing." Obasi was quiet for a moment. "We'll need to send an updated package," she said. "Not just mathematical sequences, something that carries more of what we are." "What would you include?" She thought about it. "The emergence thing," she said finally. "The way we produce novelty. The way a child is something neither parent is. The way a conversation between two people produces an idea neither of them had alone." A pause. "The way loneliness and connection are both real for us, and we live in the tension between them, and somehow that tension is a feature and not a bug." "That'll be hard to put in mathematical notation." "Most true things are," she said. I got back to Earth 36 hours later. The debrief lasted 3 days, and I will not describe it except to say that it was thorough in the way that institutional processes are thorough when they are trying very hard to transform a singular experience into a document that can be filed and referenced, and used as the basis for policy. On the 4th day, Eli picked me up from the facility and drove me home in silence for most of the journey, which was correct, and then said near the end, "Maya wants to talk to you." "I know. He paused. "She's been good with them, she's good." "I know she is. What she did not telling you immediately, she wasn't trying to." "Eli," I said. He stopped. "I know," I said again. He drove for another minute. The city was doing what it always did, going about the business of existing without particular awareness that somewhere in a government briefing room, a group of humans had just spent 3 days trying to put into words an encounter that had no existing words. The traffic lights changed. People walked on sidewalks. A child on a bicycle wobbled across an intersection with the intense concentration of someone who has recently mastered a new skill and is not yet confident enough to be casual about it. The ordinary world had continued. That was the strange thing about it. The Kethra had come and gone, and Myra Station was already resuming normal operations, and people were filing back into the corridors where they drilled for emergencies, and the school's geology lesson was still on the display board somewhere. And two 4-month-old children who had no idea what had happened were in a house a few blocks away, and their father was coming home. The conversation with Maya happened in Eli's living room while the twins slept in the next room, which gave the conversation a particular quality: the awareness of stakes, the closeness of the reason why the stakes were what they were. Maya sat across from me with the specific posture of someone who has been rehearsing a speech and has decided at the last moment to abandon it and just talk. She talked. I listened. She explained the months she'd spent not knowing how to say it, not knowing what she wanted, not knowing whether she wanted to disrupt the life I'd been living because she knew how much I'd already lost. She explained the moment the twins were born and she saw them, and understood that the decision had effectively already been made by something that had nothing to do with what she wanted, because they were real now, they were people, and the person who'd helped make them was out there in the world and deserved to know. She said she was sorry for the month of silence. I told her I understood. I meant it. I understood the particular paralysis of a decision that keeps getting deferred because every possible version of making it feels like it will break something. And so you defer it until something breaks anyway, and then the breaking is worse than the decision would have been. I understood it the way I'd understood the Kethra's question about loneliness, from the inside, not the outside. We were quiet for a moment. Then she said, a little carefully, "What was it like out there?" I thought about how to answer. I thought about the blue light in the dark, the 9 hours of laborious, imprecise, extraordinary communication, the way the nearest Kethra had raised its limb in the gesture that wasn't a mirror of mine but meant the same thing. Like meeting someone, I said. Someone very different, but the same things mattered, the same things were interesting. What things? Connection, I said, why we want it, what it costs us, why we keep trying even when it doesn't work. Maya looked at me. She had the same look Obasi had had, the look of someone encountering something they hadn't expected and hadn't prepared for and weren't sure whether to step toward or step back. She stepped toward. The twins slept through all of this with the total moral certainty of 4-month-olds, who have correctly identified that the world will continue to exist regardless of the conversations adults are having in the next room. That evening I sat with both of them, one on each side of me, Freya already demonstrating the independent streak that would apparently define her for the rest of her life, by refusing to be held in the standard position, and insisting on facing outward, Cassius apparently perfectly content to exist in the position I'd offered and make slow investigating movements with his hands against my forearm. I held them and thought about the Kethra question, about why humans carry things alone when they don't have to. I didn't have a complete answer, even now. I thought it had something to do with the way the private sorrow is also, sometimes, private joy. The intensity of experience that comes from being a single consciousness moving through the world without the buffering of a collective. The way everything hits you directly, undiluted. The way grief is devastating and also, sometimes, clarifying. The way sitting in a room with cold coffee and a life that has just changed shape can be. In the same moment, the worst thing and the moment you see most clearly what actually matters. Cassius wrapped one small hand around my finger. He wasn't grabbing for any particular reason. He was 4 months old. His hands just did this. Everything within reach was an occasion for investigation. But the weight of it, the small specific pressure of that grip, was something I hadn't been expecting, and I sat with it for a moment and didn't move. The Kethra had asked about the child who was something neither parent was. They'd asked about emergence, about novelty, about the mechanism by which two existing things combined to produce a third thing that was genuinely new. I tried to explain it and mostly failed, but the explanation didn't matter as much as the fact of it. The fact that I was sitting here, in Eli's house, with 2 children who should not exist by any reasonable accounting of how my life was supposed to go, who were here precisely because the life I'd planned had come apart and something else had grown in the wreckage. New things from old materials. The trick the Kethra didn't have. I thought about what I was going to tell them, years from now, about where they came from, about the night their father found out they existed, and also found out that the species had made its first confirmed contact with an intelligence from 4 light years away, and both things happened in the same hour, and both things were real. I thought they'd probably have opinions about that. I thought Freya, in particular, would have many opinions about that, starting from the moment she was old enough to form them and continuing indefinitely. I was looking forward to it. The Kethra, I thought, would never know what it felt like to be completely alone, which meant they would also never know what it felt like to choose not to be. The universe kept expanding. The signal we'd sent 90 years ago was still traveling outward through the dark, a return address on a letter that said, "We exist, we are curious, we want to know who else is out there." The Kethra had come to see who sent it. 17 other species had sent something similar, and most of them were gone now, or changed, or gone quiet. We were still here. Not because we were strong enough or clever enough, or because we had weapons the Kethra couldn't defeat. Because when faced with something genuinely other, genuinely unknown, genuinely capable of ending us, there had been a human being willing to sit in the discomfort of not knowing and not run. Just that, just the willingness to stay. Freya made a sound that was between a cough and an opinion. I adjusted her position. She reassessed the situation, decided this was acceptable, and resumed her investigation of the middle distance with an expression of profound philosophical detachment. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to turn the pale gray that comes before dawn. Somewhere above it, invisible in the daylight, Myra Station turned in its orbit. Somewhere beyond that, the Kethra vessel moved through the outer system, carrying back whatever it had come to find. I sat with my children and watched the sky get lighter and thought about what it cost a person to stay, to not run from the hard thing, to hold the complicated life without flinching, the life that didn't look like what you'd planned, that had been broken and rebuilt in a shape you hadn't chosen, that contained people who'd hurt you, and people who'd surprised you, and 2 small people who had no idea yet what any of it meant. It cost something, it always cost something. But it also gave something back, and what it gave back was this, the possibility of being known. Really known, the way you can only be known if you stay still long enough for someone to see you. Not the version of you that exists in the smooth surface you present to the world, but the version that carries things alone even when it doesn't have to, that builds nurseries for the wrong reasons, that drives to a government facility at 3 in the morning because it spent 11 years learning how to listen, that walks through the airlock of an alien vessel because the alternative is unacceptable. The Kethra had asked whether a single entity could speak for a collective. I'd told them, a single human cannot speak for all. A single human can choose to try. I believe that more now than when I said it. I believe that every human who had ever stayed in a difficult conversation, stayed with a grief instead of running from it, stayed in the room when everything said leave, had been speaking for all of us, saying, "This is what we are. This is what we do. We remain." Maya came and stood in the doorway after a while. She didn't say anything. I didn't say anything. We'd done a lot of talking in the last few days, and I think we were both relieved to be in a moment that didn't require it. She was holding a mug of tea, and she leaned against the doorframe with the posture of someone who has been awake too long but isn't ready to sleep yet, who is in that particular place between exhaustion and alertness, where things feel very clear and very quiet at the same time. Cassius made a sound. She smiled at it, the involuntary smile that babies produce in people regardless of circumstance, the one that bypasses every kind of decision-making and just happens. "He does that thing," she said softly, where he sounds like he's commentating on something, like a very small sports announcer. I noticed that, I said. Freya does the opposite. She's completely silent and then suddenly very loud about something. Strong opinions. Very strong opinions about milk temperature, she said. We've had words. I held Freya a little tighter. She didn't stir. The Kethra were moving through the outer system, carrying back whatever they'd come to find. Somewhere in 4 years of travel time, a signal would arrive at wherever they came from, not the mathematical probe signal, not the XCD transmission, but something less quantifiable. A record, an account of what they'd found out here in this unremarkable corner of the galaxy. What they would say about us, I didn't know. What notation they'd use to describe a species that insisted on being lonely even when it didn't have to be, that carried its sorrows alone, that built nurseries for the wrong reasons, that sent signals into the dark, and then walked through alien airlocks to keep the conversation going. I hoped they'd describe us accurately. I hoped they'd get the contradiction right, that the same quality that made us isolate ourselves, that made us defer the hard conversation and avoid the vulnerability, was also the quality that made the choice to stay meaningful. You couldn't choose to stay unless you could also choose to go. The cost of the thing was what made it real. The sky outside was fully light now. The ordinary morning was arriving, with its ordinary sounds, traffic, somewhere a dog, the particular mechanical complaint of a refused truck somewhere on the next street doing its slow and necessary work. The world going about its business, unchanged, continuous, indifferent in the best possible way. Freya finally fell asleep against my shoulder. Cassius had been asleep for 20 minutes, making the small manufacturing sounds that sleeping infants make, apparently producing something in there, though what was unclear. I held them in the pale morning light. I stayed,